With this video, we are completing the first book of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in the Terence Irwin Hackett 3rd edition. And this video is going to be one of the most important in our series because of the importance of this portion of the work. We left off just completing chapter 5 last time. And so with chapter 6, Aristotle turns his attention to his great predecessor's theory of the good, his great predecessor being, of course, the philosopher Plato. He takes up in chapter 6 what he calls the universal good, which refers to the Platonic form or idea of the good. The Greek word is eidos. This is discussed most extensively and significantly in Plato's Republic, in which it's presented as the absolute principle of all reality, and thus the very goal of all philosophical activity. It's famously obscure what this form is supposed to be, and I've listed here some of the features of it that emerge from Plato's Republic and other sources, just to give us a bit of background on it. So we'll go through these fairly quickly without dwelling too much on them. First of all, a form or idea, whether of the good or of anything else, which again translates this word eidos, is a specific entity. And yet it's not a concrete entity. It's not physical or soul-like, but rather it's a purely intelligible nature. That is, it can only be accessed through a rational process of pure thinking that abstracts from everything in the mind that's given by the senses or by experience. The good is a purely formal entity, which is purely abstract. It's also universal. It represents the universal quality or paradigm of goodness, the universal archetype of goodness. Yet it's also a specific entity, and thus it's a particular perfect instance of goodness. It's not physical or soul-like anyway, and yet it is causally responsible, it seems, for the very being or reality of every good thing, of every good body, of every good soul. And thus the form of the good has an explanatory function. It explains the goodness of particular things, why they are good. So the answer to the question of why a particular thing is good is it participates, to use Plato's favorite term, it participates in the form of the good, or partakes of the form of the good. Now, according to Plato, a lawmaker or ruler in the city is required to have philosophical knowledge of this form or idea in order to be qualified to rule in the city. So one needs to have this purely intelligible kind of knowledge of this mysterious entity, the form of the good, in order to be a statesman in the city, a ruler of the city, a legislator in the city. That's Plato's requirement. And this is what Aristotle is taking on in chapter 6. So these are the qualities. Now, it's with some reluctance that Aristotle rejects Plato's account of the good. He expresses actually a bit of embarrassment at this because Plato was his teacher and he's friendly with his disciples. And so, the bottom of page 5 here, opening of chapter 6, he says, "This sort of inquiry is, to be sure, unwelcome to us, because those who introduce the forms are friends of ours." And then he goes on to say, but nonetheless, we have to place a love of truth over friendship. And so out of the love of truth, Aristotle proclaims, he raises several objections to the Platonic theory of the good that are intended to reveal its inadequacy. Now, not all of these arguments, in my view, are of equal cogency, and some of them depend upon assumptions that are just as controversial as Plato's theory of the forms itself is. For example, the very first argument seems to depend upon the rather peculiar assumptions that, one, the common property of a numerical series must itself be a member of the series, and 2, that fundamental ontological categories, such as the categories of substance, relative, etc., form a numerical series. I'm not sure why either of these things should be the case. What I want to focus on is the most trenchant and intractable objections to Plato's view of the good. The second argument is a much more interesting one. So this is at section 3 in our text. Aristotle argues as follows. Further, good is spoken of in as many ways as being is spoken of. In what is, as God and mind, in quality as the virtues, in quantity as the measured amount, in relative as the useful, in time as the opportune moment, in place as the right situation, and so on. Hence it is clear that the good cannot be some common and single universal, for if it were, it would be spoken of in only one of the predications, not in them all. So the argument seems to be something like this. Premise 1. If the good is something universal and held in common by all good things, then there must be a single sense of the term good that applies to all good things. Premise 1. If the good is something universal and held in common by all good things, then there must be a single sense or meaning of the term good that applies to all good things. Premise 2. The term good is spoken of many things in many different ways. Premise 2. The term good is, actually, spoken of many things in many different ways. Premise 3. These ways of speaking of the good are not all reducible to a single sense of good. Premise 3. These ways of speaking of the good are not all reducible to a single sense of good. Conclusion, therefore, the good is not something universal. This argument has something to be said for it, although I think the Platonists would reject premise 3, that these ways of speaking of the good are not all reducible to a single sense, and then he and the Aristotelian would have to battle it out. But at least there is some initial plausibility there that we speak of the good in so many different senses. Why suppose there's one universal form of the good that covers all of these diverse cases? The third argument in section 4 points out the non-existence of a single science of the good. So he says here at section 4, further, if a number of things have one idea, there is also one science of them. Hence, if there were an idea of the good, there would also be one science of all goods. But in fact, there are many sciences, even of the goods under one type of predication. For the science of the opportune moment, for instance, war and generalship, in disease, medicine. So the science of the opportune moment, there's an opportune moment in which to attack in war that military science studies, and there's an opportune moment in which to, let's say, lance a boil or drain an abscess that medicine would study. And similarly, the science of the measured amount of food in medicine, in exertion, gymnastics. So the idea here is that, for example, the good of medicine and the good of gymnastics are not the same thing, and being able to know and produce the one doesn't necessarily mean you can know and produce the other. And so corresponding to all these senses of goodness that he mentioned in the previous argument, there are all these different disciplines and sciences that deal with them, and their knowledge is mutually exclusive. And I guess the conclusion is that he thinks this suggests that there isn't some one goodness, that if you know that, then you know all of the, you're able to make all of the judgments about what would be good in the different circumstances that these different sciences study. If you only knew the form of the good, you would know when the right time to attack was on the battlefield, when the right time was to drain an abscess, and et cetera, et cetera. You know the way in which to make the body healthy in the case of gymnastics and medicine and all the rest. So this argument might be less cogent, though, since it seems possible that there's a generic conception of the good that the specific sciences might simply render more specific, as there is a generic conception of logic, that the different disciplines that use logical argumentation apply in more specific ways. So perhaps Aristotle is being a little bit too stringent with Plato here. Plato could perhaps be read as saying that this philosophical knowledge of the form of the good is a necessary preliminary in order to be able to apply the concept of the good in all these more specific cases. Just like perhaps a general knowledge of logic and logical argumentation is necessary in order to apply logic in, say, jurisprudence as well as in science and in other, natural science and other areas. So the next argument is dense, but it seems to be challenging the Platonist claim that the form of the good has explanatory power to explain the goodness of things. And it does this by the Platonic view that the form of the good represents a separate entity, the universal quality or paradigm of goodness that all good things possess, which is causally responsible for their goodness. And yet it's also a specific entity, and thus it's a specific instance of goodness. So it's challenging the cogency of an explanatory principle, in this case, of course, the form of the good, that has these contrary qualities. That it's being a separate entity and then a universal quality and then also a specific entity that's a particular instance of that quality. So the argument here goes something like this. This is section 5. One might be puzzled about what they really mean in speaking of the so-and-so itself, since man itself and man have one and the same account of man. For insofar as each is man, they will not differ at all. If that is so, then neither will they differ at all insofar as each is good. So this is very dense and condensed, as I suggested, but we might glean something like the following line of reasoning here. Premise 1. The form of the good man, on the one hand, and a good man, on the other hand, are defined in the same way. The form of the good man and a good man are defined in the same way. Premise 2. If two things have the same definition, they are the same in essence. Premise 2. If two things have the same definition, they are the same in essence. Premise 3. Thus, the form of the good man and a good man have the same essence. Premise 3. The form of the good man and a good man have the same essence. Premise 4. Things that have the same essence are the same. Premise 4. Things that have the same essence are the same. Premise 5. Thus, the form of the good man and a good man are the same. Premise 5. Thus, the form of the good man and a good man are the same. Premise 6. If two things are the same, one thing cannot be the explanation of the other. If two things are the same, one thing cannot be the explanation of the other. And thus, the conclusion, the form of the good man cannot be the explanation of the goodness of a man. So this argument, once again, the form of a good man and a good man are defined in the same way. If two things have the same definition, they're the same in essence. Thus, the form of the good man and a good man have the same essence. Things that have the same essence are the same. Therefore, the form of the good man and a good man are the same. If two things are the same, then one cannot be the explanation of another. So the form of the good man cannot be the explanation of the goodness of a man. If this argument is sound, then it would seem to render idle and explanatorily impotent the form of the good. Finally, Aristotle argues that the Platonic view is caught in a dilemma between, on the one hand, making the goodness of the form either implausibly monopolistic and exclusive, or else, on the other hand, making the form idle and superfluous as an explanatory principle. So this is in sections 10 and 11. But what sorts of goods would one take to be goods in their own right? Are they the goods that are pursued even on their own? For instance, prudence, seeing, some types of pleasures and honors? For even if we also pursue these because of something else, may we nonetheless take them to be goods in their own right. Or rather, we may nonetheless take them to be goods in their own right. Alternatively, is nothing except the idea good in its own right, so that the form will be futile? But if these other things are also good in their own right, then the same account of good will have to turn up in all of them, just as the same account of whiteness turns up in snow and in chalk. In fact, however, honor, prudence, and pleasure have different and dissimilar accounts in the respect in which they are goods. Hence, the good is not something common corresponding to a single idea. So, something like this. Premise 1. Either, option 1, the form of the good is the only good that's good in its own right, or else option 2, there are other things that are good in their own right. So that's premise 1. Either option 1, the form of the good is the only good that's good in its own right, or else option 2, there are other things that are good in their own right. If option 1 is chosen, and one says that no, the form of the good is the only good that's good in its own right, then the theory is terribly implausible, since there appear to be a number of particular things besides the form of the good that are good in their own right, namely the ones that Aristotle just listed here. So that's premise 2. If option 1 is chosen and one insists that the form of the good is the only thing that's good in its own right, then this theory is terribly implausible, since there appear to be a number of particular things beside the form of the good that are good in their own right. Premise 3, if option 2 is chosen, and one says that no, there are other things that are good in their own right, then in that case, the form of the good does no necessary explanatory work. We can explain why certain ends are chosen by appeal to the particular things that are good in their own right, whether it be honor or pleasure or what have you. And the goodness of these does not need to be explained because they're good in their own right. It's self-explanatory why they're pursued, because they're good in their own right. You don't need some further explanation why pursue pleasure or honor on this line of thinking. So that's premise 3. If option 2 is chosen and one insists that there are other things that are good in their own right, then the form of the good doesn't do any explanatory work anymore, because we can explain by why certain ends are chosen by appeal to the particular things that are good in their own right. So you see, the argument is the structure here posing a dilemma. You have these two possibilities, and no matter which possibility you take, it ends up with a bad conclusion for Plato's theory. So the conclusion is that either the Platonic theory is terribly implausible, or else it's idle and unnecessary. Aristotle concludes chapter 6 with what I think is really his decisive objection to Plato, that ethics, as he conceives of it, is a practical science. Ethics is a practical science. It aims at realizing the good human life in the polis. And Plato's theory is simply too theoretical. It's too abstract and speculative to be very practical. So this is what he says beginning in section 13. He says, if there is some one good predicated in common or some separable good itself in its own right, clearly this is not the sort of good a human being can achieve in action or possess. But that is the sort we're looking at now. Perhaps someone might think it's better to get to know the idea with a view to the goods that we can possess and achieve in action if we have this as a sort of pattern. We shall also know better about the goods that are good for us. And if we know about them, we shall hit upon them. So that's Plato's idea, that you need to have this idea of the good so that you can have a pattern that's going to enable you to pick out those good things and pursue them in life. And Aristotle concedes, well, this argument has some plausibility. He says, but it would seem to clash with the sciences. For each of these, though it aims at some good and seeks to supply what is lacking, leaves out knowledge of the idea, the form of the knowledge of the form of the good. But surely it would not be reasonable for all craftsmen to know nothing about such an important aid, and not even to look for it. Moreover, it is a puzzle to know what the weaver or carpenter will gain for his own craft from knowing the good itself, or how anyone will be better at medicine or generalship from having viewed the idea itself. For what the doctor appears to consider is not even health, but human health, and presumably the health of this particular human being even more, since he treats one particular patient at the time. So just as it appears that the weaver can get along just fine without knowledge of the form of the tunic, so perhaps too the legislator can get along without knowledge of the form of the good city. And Aristotle really sides here with his own particularistic emphasis over Platonic universalism, especially in this last passage I read, that if you actually look at the sciences and the crafts that are concerned with promoting the goods of a certain subject or area of human life, they focus on the particular, the health of this particular human body, not the idea of health in general. And that's the kind of science that the ethico-political science is for him, one that's focused on helping us understand how to pursue the particular human good. All right, so this brings us to chapter 7 then. Having set aside Plato's theory of the good, Aristotle returns to his inquiry into the nature of the human good. And it's useful, I think, to remind ourselves of the status of that inquiry at this point in his ethics. So far, it's looking as if the happy life is more likely to consist in a life of civic virtue than a life spent in the pursuit of gratification. However, there was a caveat, you'll recall. If the life devoted to civic virtue meets with terrible misfortunes and evils, for example, catastrophic illness, loss of loved ones, natural disaster, or other such extreme bad luck, then it will not be a happy one. We might view this actually as a concession of sorts to the pleasure lover, that gratification, in a sense, does have a role to play in rounding out a happy life. It should not play the dominant role, but pleasure can't be utterly absent either. In addition, some insights emerge during the consideration of the lives of gratification and political activity that suggest why the life of civic virtue is the most promising candidate for the happy life. In reflecting upon why the life of gratification doesn't seem to be suitable, a condition of the good life emerged, namely the condition of being distinctively human. The good life, it seemed on reflection, should be distinctively human, and that's the problem with the life of gratification. It reduces the human life to something akin to the life of a grazing animal. Likewise, it emerged that the lives devoted to money-making and honor-seeking were not suitable because these violated the condition of being pursued for its own sake. Pursued for its own sake. Money-making is not pursued for its own sake, but for the sake of what money can get us. Honor-seeking, it turned out on reflection, is not pursued for its own sake either, although in some contexts, Aristotle does treat honor as something that is valued for its own sake. But it turned out that actually honor is something that's good only if it takes the form of recognition of some actual virtue that one has, that one's being honored for something really true about oneself that's good, that's separate from the honor. Further, the honor-seeking life was inadequate because happiness is supposed to be something that is a possession within oneself. But honor is never really a possession. Honor isn't really something that one can possess because it has to be constantly bestowed by others, and it vanishes as soon as they stop bestowing it. The locus of the honor, so to speak, is elsewhere. It's not in oneself. It's in other people's relation to you. Finally, the deficiency of the life of virtue-seeking seemed to be that it was not sufficient by itself for happiness. The life of virtue-seeking doesn't guarantee good fortune, and so it seemed like it wasn't sufficient by itself. So, to summarize these, in his reflection upon the opinions of the cultivated about the most favored lives, Aristotle discovered several desiderata, several desirable features of the happiest life. The happiest life should be distinctively human, pursued for its own sake, a possession within oneself, and sufficient by itself for happiness. So next, Aristotle will try to tie these observations together and give them systematic unity and a principled foundation. This is the task of the all-important chapter 7 of Book 1, which is the pivotal chapter of Book 1 and one of the most important in the entire work. Aristotle proceeds here to lay out 3 criteria that any adequate conception of happiness will have to satisfy. 3 criteria. So what are these 3 criteria? Call these the 3 criteria of happiness. And we think of this as the criteria, we can also think of this criteria of a happy life. First, completeness. Second, self-sufficiency. And third, being most choice-worthy. So we can say the happy life will be complete put it this way. The happy life must be these 3 things: complete, self-sufficient, and most choice-worthy. Complete, self-sufficient, and most choice-worthy. So what are these things? Okay, so first of all, completeness. What's the completeness consist of? This idea is that it must always be desirable for its own sake, and never only for the sake of something else. Completeness is the quality of always being desirable for its own sake, and never only for the sake of something else. So we see here in section 3, since there are apparently many ends, and we choose some of them, for instance, wealth, flutes, and in general instruments, because of something else, it is clear that not all ends are complete. But the best good is apparently something complete. And so if only one end is complete, what we are looking for will be this end. But if more ends than one are complete, it will be the most complete of these. Now we say that an end pursued in its own right is more complete than an end pursued for something else, and then an end that is never choice-worthy because of something else is more complete than ends that are choice-worthy both in their own right and because of this end. Hence, an end that is always choice-worthy in its own right, never because of something else, is complete without qualification. Now, happiness, more than anything else, seems complete without qualification. For this we choose always because of itself, never because of something else. But honor, pleasure, understanding, and every virtue we choose because of themselves also, since we would choose each of them even if it had no further result. But we also choose them for the sake of happiness, supposing that through them we shall be happy. Happiness, however, no one ever chooses for their own sake, but for the sake of something else at all. So completeness is this quality of being always desired for its own sake and never only for the sake of something else. And Aristotle suggests here that there might be other things besides happiness that are complete in this sense. For example, pleasure, understanding, and virtue. But in that case, we should say that happiness is the most complete because we choose these other complete things, these subordinate complete things, also for the sake of happiness. Happiness is the most complete in that sense. So remember, lack of completeness was the problem with the lives of money-making and honor-seeking. Money is desirable only for the sake of what it can buy, and so it's not a complete end. Honor only for the sake of the public recognition it provides for virtue, and so not for its own sake. But happiness is always chosen for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. This is why it's the most complete end. In a sense, we might say that it's the endiness of all ends, the end of all ends. So it's most complete. So anything that's going to satisfy the concept of happiness has to be complete. That's the first, in this sense. Second, self-sufficient. what's self-sufficiency in this sense? This is the quality that's such that possessing it makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. Possessing self-sufficiency makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. This is not to be confused with being a self-sufficient person in one's happiness. Let's say like being a hermit who can, just be happy being by themselves, and in that sense is self-sufficient. But that's not what he means. In fact, for Aristotle, happiness is not something that you can possess in that way entirely within oneself. He mentions this in section 6. But he says, but what we're referring to here as self-sufficient is not what suffices for a solitary person by himself living an isolated life, but what suffices also for parents, children, wife, and in general for friends and fellow citizens, since a human being is naturally political animal that we referred to before. So that's, by self-sufficiency, we don't mean that someone could possess happiness in isolation. But what we mean is that the happiness is self-sufficient, that possessing it makes life desirable and lacking in nothing. This point seems to be somewhat in tension with the earlier criticism of the life of honor, that the criticism that it's dependent upon others and not in one's own possession. So the idea here is that the conception of happiness, even if it involves relationships to other people, is nonetheless going to be a conception that once you have that conception before your mind, you're not going to say, oh, that conception's missing something. That the conception is self-sufficient. It's not that the person who possesses the happiness is self-sufficient, or they possess it in a way that frees them from all dependency upon other people. That's not what he's saying. It's that the conception is self-sufficient and lacking in nothing. This sort of lack of self-sufficiency was the problem with the life of civic virtue, that possessing that life, one might still fail to be happy if a decent amount of material good fortune was lacking from your life. If the virtuous person suffered from lifelong poverty or ill health or personal tragedy or something like that, one could possess the life of civic virtue and yet still not be happy. And in that sense, the life of civic virtue would be not a self-sufficient conception of happiness in this sense, because a conception is self-sufficient if it shows that if you possess happiness in the sense that the conception describes, your life will be desirable completely and lacking in nothing. That's self-sufficiency. So the third is the most choice-worthy. And this is the idea that it would always be chosen over any other end. In other words, if you're imagining alternative lives and asked to choose which one, in a direct face-off with any other good, it would always be chosen. It has, as we say, no competition. This implies that happiness doesn't consist of the quantitative sum of some good that could be added to and made a little better by that addition. As in the case of, let's say, the life of the moneymaker or the life of gratification. In those lives, you could imagine, you could, just to make it as literal as possible, you can imagine someone who has, 15,313,000,000 dollars, and they could imagine themselves having, 15,314,000,000, right? So it's always possible to think of a life that's somewhat better by adding more to it. And that's not the kind of thing that happiness or the happy life consists in for Aristotle, because in that kind of case, it would be impossible for the happy life to ever be more choice-worthy. There would always be possible to have a life that's a little more choice-worthy than the one possesses. So this is what he's describing in section 8. Moreover, we think happiness is most choice-worthy of all goods, since it is not counted as one good among many. If it were counted as one good among many, then clearly we think it would be more choice-worthy if the smallest of goods were added. For the good that is added becomes an extra quantity of goods, and the larger of two goods is always more choice-worthy. Happiness, then, is apparently something complete and self-sufficient, since it is the end of things achievable in action. So In saying that the happy life is the most choice-worthy, he's saying that it doesn't make sense from his perspective to hold the view that one could always be a little happier. The happy life is either such that either you're happy or you aren't happy. There's no such thing as being a little bit happy on this conception. This reveals one of the main deficiencies in the life of gratification, because in theory, at least, it's always possible to imagine a life containing a little bit more pleasure, no matter how much pleasure one's life contains. No particular life centered on gratification can possibly be the most choice-worthy. From within such a life, looking backward, one could always have lived a slightly more pleasurable life. And looking forwards, the pleasures one chooses will always involve rejecting others that are equally choice-worthy. So the life of gratification doesn't admit of being most choice-worthy, no matter how much pleasure you have. So that would be ruled out by this. Just as it seems the life of civic virtue has problems with this criterion of self-sufficiency, and the life of honor pursuit would have problems with completeness, as would the life of the moneymaker. This leads to the first discussion question. Are Aristotle's criteria for judging a life to be happy adequate? Are all of them necessary in order for a life to be happy? Is it possible for the happy life to be realized apart from one or more of these criteria? If these criteria are fulfilled, does that in fact guarantee that the life is good? Would you reject any of the criteria on his list or add any to his list? Would you reject any of these criteria or would you add any to this list? Okay, so once again, that's the second discussion question. Are Aristotle's criteria for judging a life to be happy adequate? Are all of them necessary in order for a life to be happy? Is it possible for the happy life to be realized apart from one or more of these criteria? If these criteria are fulfilled, does that in fact guarantee that the life is good? Would you reject any of the criteria on his list or add any to the list? With this criteria of a good human life, a happy human life, Aristotle has gathered together all of the main insights of his examination of the most favored lives, except for one. The notion that the happy life will involve activity that's distinctively human. This insight is the next item to receive systematic treatment. Chapter 7 ends with what is arguably the high point of Book 1 and perhaps the linchpin of the entire Nicomachean ethics. This is Aristotle's argument that has traditionally been known as the function argument. The function argument. The conclusion of this argument is, the function argument, is Aristotle's first clear statement of what the best good, the happy life, consists in. Performing the human function well, activity that's an instance of excellent human functioning, where excellent human functioning is just another name for human virtue. The argument is presented as follows, beginning in section 9. But presumably the remark that the best good is happiness is apparently something generally agreed, and we still feel the need of a clearer statement of what the best good is. Perhaps then we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, i.e. doing well for a flautist, a sculptor, and every craftsman, and in general for whatever has a function and characteristic action, seems to depend upon its function, the same seems to be true for the human being, if a human being has some function. Then do the carpenter and the leather worker have their function and actions, but the human being has no function? Is he by nature idle without any function? Or just as eye, hand, foot, and in general every bodily part apparently has its function, may we likewise ascribe to a human being some function apart from these? And that clearly is intended to be a rhetorical question. So he then next asks, well, what then could this be? For living is apparently shared with plants, but what we are looking for is the special function of a human being. Hence, we should set aside the life of nutrition and growth. The life next in order is some sort of life of sense perception, but this too is apparently shared with horse, ox, and every animal. The remaining possibility then is some sort of life of action of the part of the soul that has reason. One part of it has reason as obeying reason. The other has it as having reason and thinking. Moreover, life is also spoken of in two ways, as capacity and as activity, and we must take a human being's special function to be life as activity, since this seems to be called life most fully. We have found then that the human function is activity of the soul in accord with or requiring reason. Now, as we say that the function of a kind of thing, such as a harpist, is the same in kind as the function of an excellent individual of the kind, such as an excellent harpist, and the same is true without qualification in every case, if we add to the function of the superior achievement in accord with the virtue. For the function of a harpist is to play the harp, and the function of a good harpist is to play it well. Moreover, we take the human function to be a certain kind of life, and take this life to be activity and actions of the soul that involve reason. Hence, the function of the excellent man is to do this well or finely. Now, the function is completed well by being completed in accord with the virtue proper to that kind of thing. The function is completed well by being completed in accord with the virtue proper to that kind of thing. And further, in a complete life. For one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one day, nor similarly does one day or a short time make us blessed and happy. So this argument, I think, can be helpfully broken down into three parts. So these are the three parts of the function argument as I'm reading it here. And part one would be that the human being has a function. The human being has a function. Part two is that the human function is activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. That's part two. And then part three is the conclusion of the argument, which is that the human good is activity enabled by virtues of character and thought. So these are the three stages of the argument then, of the function argument. Part one says that the human being has a function. Part two is that the human function is activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. And then the conclusion is that the human good is activity enabled by the virtues of character and thought. The human good is activity enabled by the virtues of character and thought. Those are the three parts of the functional argument. So first, let's look at part one, the argument that the human being has a function. How does that go? Something like this. Premise one, human beings have bodies with parts that have functions. Premise one, human beings have bodies with parts that have functions. The heart pumps the blood, the stomach digests the food, etc. That's premise one. Human beings have bodies with parts that have functions. Premise two, human beings occupy specific roles and occupations that have functions. Premise two, human beings occupy specific roles and occupations that have functions. For example, the gatekeeper, who has the function of opening and closing the gate. The custodian, who has the function of cleaning the building. The garbage collector. And also the mother, who has a certain function within the family. The father, who has a certain function. The daughter. The groomsman. The bridesmaid. So human life is filled with these roles and occupations that have functions. Premise three, and this is the key premise. This is going to be the crucial premise, I think, really of the entire argument. And it's this. So a being who has a body with parts that have functions, like the heart and the stomach, and who occupies specific roles that have functions, like the gatekeeper and the bridesmaid, a being like that is a being who has an overall function. So a being who has a body with parts that have functions and who occupies specific roles that have functions is a being who has an overall function. That's premise three. And this leads to the conclusion that hence the human being has a function. And this serves as premise four in the overall argument. So that's the argument for the first part, that the human being has a function, that human beings have bodies with parts that have functions. Human beings occupy specific roles and occupations that have functions. A being who has a body with parts that have functions and who occupies specific roles that have functions is a being who has an overall function. Hence, the human being has a function. That's the first part. So what about part two? So beginning part two, which is to lead to this conclusion here. We begin with premise 5 in the overall argument. Premise 5. The function of a being is what specifically distinguishes it from all other beings. The function of a being is what specifically distinguishes it from all other beings. So, it's not really clear whether this is referring to all other beings that have functions, whether all beings are understood to have functions, but clearly Aristotle has this idea that the different functions are what distinguish the different types of beings. And you can think of this clearly if you think of something like tools that have functions. What distinguishes, let's say, a screwdriver from a knife from a hammer? Well, a screwdriver has a different function from a knife, which has a different function from a hammer, and so forth. What distinguishes the gatekeeper from the custodian, from the general? Well, they have different functions that distinguish them from one another. So that's the idea of premise 5. The function of a being is what specifically distinguishes it from all other beings. Premise 6. Thus, the function of a human being is some activity that specifically distinguishes the human being from all other beings. Premise 6. Thus, the function of a human being is some activity that specifically distinguishes the human being from all other beings. Premise 7. The only such activity is rational activity, or as Aristotle puts it, activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. Why does he put it that way? In accordance with reason or requiring reason. Why doesn't he just say rational activity? Well, there's a division, it will turn on, an important division in Aristotle between activity of the soul in accordance with reason, and that concerns what he will call the virtues of character, versus activity of the soul requiring reason, and that concerns the virtues of thought. So I think it'll be useful for us, even though this is in advance of where Aristotle introduces this terminology, to keep that in mind right from the beginning. That's why he puts it in this rather odd way. because he's thinking of two different arenas, so to speak, in which human activity has to do with reason, and it employs reason in different ways in these different domains. So premise 5 is that such activity is rational activity, the activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. And that leads to the conclusion to part 2, which is premise 8 overall. Hence, the human function is activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. So the second stage of the argument, once again, is that the function of a being is what specifically distinguishes it from all other beings. The function of a human being is some activity that specifically distinguishes the human being from all other beings. The only such activity, distinguishing activity, is rational activity, activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. And that leads to the conclusion that the human function is activity of the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. Now, the final stage of the argument is intended to connect this notion of the human function to a notion of the human good, leading to the conclusion that the human good is activity enabled by the virtues of character and thought. And again, in introducing this language of the virtues of character and thought, I'm leaping ahead to the later portions of the Nicomachean ethics, but I think doing so will help to dispel some of the obscurity of Aristotle's terminology here. So I'm anticipating his later theorizing. Okay, so premise 9. The good of anything that has a function is performing its function well. The good of anything that has a function is performing its function well. So, very straightforward, a good knife is a knife that performs the function of a knife well, namely that cuts well, and so on with all the other tools. Premise 10. What enables a functioning being to be well-performing is called virtue. Premise 10. What enables a functioning being to be well-performing is called virtue, by definition. So, well-performing knife has the virtues of a knife. One of the virtues of a knife is sharpness, because it enables it to perform its function of cutting. The sharper it is, the better a knife it is, or we might alternatively say, or equivalently say, the more virtue it has, because the better it can perform its function. And virtue here is the same, the Greek word is the same as the word for excellence. So you might, refer to a friend, a particular brand of, let's say, Japanese knife, and say, well, that knife is an excellent knife. It's the same thing. It's saying the knife is, has great virtue. Premise 11. Well-performing activity of the soul in accordance with reason is enabled by the virtues of character. So we have this thing, activity of the soul in accordance with reason, and I'm saying that when that activity is performed well, and I'm calling that well-performing activity of the soul in accordance with reason. So well-performing activity of the soul, I'm using it adjectively there, well-performing activity of the soul in accordance with reason is enabled by the virtues of character. Premise 11. Premise 12, well-performing activity of the soul requiring reason is enabled by the virtues of thought. So those two premises again. Premise 11, well-performing activity of the soul in accordance with reason is enabled by the virtues of character. And premise 12, well-performing activity of the soul requiring reason is enabled by the virtues of thought. And that's obscure right now, but it will become clear as we work through the Nicomachean ethics what that means. But the point is that these activities of the soul in accordance with reason, if they're done well, constitute really the virtues of character, or they express the virtues of character, we could say, or the virtues of thought, depending. They express the human virtues. Therefore, and this is the ultimate conclusion of the argument, the human good consists in activities that are enabled by the virtues of character and or the virtues of thought. Another shorthand way to put this would be to say that the person who has the virtues is the one who achieves the human good. The human good is enabled by the possession of the virtues. That's the basic idea. So once again, this last portion, The good of anything that has a function is performing its function well. What enables a functioning being to be well-performing is called virtue. Well-performing activity of the soul in accordance with reason is enabled by the virtues of character. Well-performing activity of the soul requiring reason is enabled by the virtues of thought. Therefore, the human good consists in activities enabled by the virtues of character and or thought. Now, a major question here, of course, is which one? What are these virtues? Which ones? All of them? Some of them? There are these two classes, apparently, virtues of character on the one hand, virtues of thought on the other. How do they relate? Those are all the questions that we have the rest of the book to work out, that he's going to be working out in the rest of the book. But for right now, he's just establishing the basic point, the kind of sketchy argument or the schematic argument that leads to the more schematic conclusion that the human good consists in activities that are enabled by the virtues. So chapter 8 contains a defense of the account of the good. Once he has his account of the human good in hand, Aristotle proceeds methodologically to check this conclusion in order to see if it harmonizes with the data of common beliefs. If it does, then this will provide added confirmation that the account is a good one. That's the methodological. So he's circling back again. We saw how he started with the reflection upon what the many and the wise, the cultivated, believe about the most favored lives. This derived criteria that he systematized and applied this argument to. And now he's going, and that arrived at a conception of the human good in a more philosophical fashion through a demonstration. And now he's going back over to check the result of this demonstration and to see if it in fact harmonizes with common beliefs. So he wants to always keep his conclusions within earshot, so to speak, of what the people are saying, what especially the educated people are saying about the topic that he's focusing on here, the human good. So he's going to check the conclusion to see if it harmonizes with common beliefs. And it turns out there are several common beliefs that this account harmonizes with. So in chapter 8 then, in relation to section 2 of chapter 8, we find that this account harmonizes with the belief that the goods of the soul are goods most fully. Because activity in accordance with reason, of course, this is going to be a good that's a property of the soul. And this harmonizes with the common belief that most people have, Aristotle thinks, that the goods of the soul are the goods most fully. That's in section 2. In section 3, we see that it harmonizes with the belief that the end that constitutes the human good must be an activity of some sort. An activity of some sort. The human good consists in some kind of activity, and that is part of his conclusion, because it's activity of the soul in accordance with or requiring reason. And then third, in section 4 of chapter 8, we see that it harmonizes with the belief that the happy person lives well and does well. Lives well and does well. That's the idea, the conceptual connection between virtue and performing a function well-performing function. That's part of Aristotle's account, and that harmonizes with the belief that a happy person is a person who's doing well. Now, with respect to the main popular accounts of the happy life, remember the life of gratification, political activity, study, and then money-making is thrown in there as a fourth inadequate possibility too. But with respect to those main popular accounts of the happy life, there's also something in Aristotle's account that they could all agree with. Obviously, those who hold that happiness is virtue would agree, as he says in section 8. And likewise, those who insist that only the active life is the happy life would also find something to agree with. You think of the person here who imagines, let's say, the life of political activity as getting things done, right? You can't be happy in life unless you accomplish something in your life. So that also harmonizes with his account, since it's specifically activities in accordance with virtue that constitutes the happy life, not merely possessing the virtues. It's not a matter of just resting on your laurels and assuring yourself that you're virtuous that constitutes the happy life, but it's actually exercising the virtues in activity. And so that harmonizes with those who believe that the happy life has to be the life of getting things done and accomplishing things. And furthermore, those who insist that the happy life must be pleasant can also find something to agree with in this account, because the person who is performing his function well is typically happy. If you think of those particular examples, like the musician examples, right? The excellent flautist or the excellent harpist. The person who's excellent at playing a musical instrument is going to take pleasure in playing that musical instrument. It's going to be happy playing that musical instrument. And so Aristotle, by extension, wants to say that also, typically, the truly virtuous person enjoys doing virtuous deeds. For example, a truly generous person is not a person who needs to be shamed or pressured into giving, who gives only out of a sense of obligation grudgingly. That's not a generous person, even if they give as much as the person next door who is a generous person. Because the person next door who really is a generous person is generous because she really enjoys it in the bottom of her heart. And that's what makes her a generous person. So as Aristotle says here in, let's see, where is this? In section 10 in chapter 8. Moreover, the life of these active people is also pleasant in itself, for being pleased is a condition of the soul. Further, each type of person finds pleasure in whatever he is called a lover of. A horse, for instance, pleases the horse lover, a spectacle the lover of spectacles. Similarly, what is just pleases the lover of justice, and in general, what accords with virtue pleases the lover of virtue. So this has an important consequence. It turns out that the virtuous life and the pleasant life are not mutually exclusive. As he says in section 12 there, hence, these people's life does not need pleasure to be added to virtuous activity as some sort of extra decoration. Rather, it has its pleasure within itself. And this is what Aristotle will call the internal pleasures. So we have this idea that there are such things as internal pleasures, which is, as he describes it here, pleasures that are within the virtuous activity itself. And that's the sense in which I would say something like, I take pleasure in generosity. I take pleasure in giving itself. There's a pleasure in giving. Why? Because I'm a generous person. And that's why I take pleasure in giving. That's an internal pleasure. So the virtuous life is a pleasant life. Because if you really have virtues, then you're going to take pleasure in virtuous activities, and then therefore you're going to possess these internal pleasures that's a function just of your virtue by itself. So we might ask here, does this solve the problem with the virtuous life that was raised in chapter 5? And it turns out that the answer to this is not quite. So he's going to add a second category to these internal pleasures, which he calls external pleasures. So we have internal pleasures and external pleasures. So what are these? He says, nonetheless, happiness evidently also needs external goods to be added, as we said, for we cannot easily do fine actions if we lack the resources. For first of all, many actions we use friends, wealth, and political power just as we use instruments. Further, deprivation of certain externals, for instance, good birth, good children, beauty, mar our blessedness. For we do not altogether have the character of happiness if we look utterly repulsive, or are ill-born, solitary, or childless, and we have it even less, presumably, if our children or friends are totally bad, or were good but have died. As we have said, therefore, happiness would seem to need this sort of prosperity added also. That is why some people identify happiness with good fortune, and others identify it with virtue. So external pleasures. We should probably change that and say external goods. So we can see these, the internal pleasures as a species of internal good, but he talks here about external good, so we'll use that terminology. And these are goods that are external to the goods that necessarily follow from virtuous activity itself. Goods that are external to the goods that necessarily follow from the virtue itself. So one might, of course, achieve external goods by virtue of one's virtue, or because of one's virtue. So one might acquire, let's say, wealth and social status because of one's virtue. Let's say because of one's bravery, one helps to win a battle in a war, and as a result acquires wealth and social status, let's say, or is enabled to marry into a good family. So external goods can be, so to speak, the reward of virtue, but they would be an external reward. They're not like the internal pleasures that one gets, let's say, just by virtue of exercising bravery itself. Things like, let's say, the sense of self-respect. Maybe not, you don't get pleasure necessarily, but there's a kind of pleasure in the sense of self-respect that you get. So external goods are things that one can acquire whether or not one has virtue. These are things that one can acquire whether or not one has virtue. And in that sense, they're external. So for example, we have Aristotle's examples here in these sections at the end of chapter 8 that I just read. Health, beauty, wealth, social status, freedom, friends, a good family, and a good reputation would be examples of these external goods. So in sum, while virtue is the core of happiness, at least a sufficient amount of these external goods are also needed. However, this is one of the most important inexact areas of ethics, because it's impossible to say precisely how much is needed in order to be sufficient. How much wealth, how much beauty does one need in order to be happy? It's not an exact science. Okay, so the main work of Book 1 is now completed. We've confirmed at least a first sketch of the account of the human good, and we need to put together the conclusion of the function argument as I laid it out and wrote it down on the whiteboard, and also this idea of external goods that I just put on the whiteboard, and combine those together. And then we get a first sketch of an account of the human good. The human good for Aristotle at this stage of the argument is sketched out as activity in accordance with and enabled by the human virtues, along with a sufficient amount of external goods. So that's the human good. Activity in accordance with and enabled by the human virtues, along with a sufficient amount of external goods. So it's got these two parts. The virtuous life by itself would not be, the complete, self-sufficient, most choice-worthy life. A life merely in pursuit of these kind of external goods would not be the best life, because you wouldn't be fulfilling the human function. Somehow these things need to be combined in a way that is going to be up to the judgment, presumably, of the person who is educated and has ethico-political knowledge. The person who has phronesis, as we'll see later on, or prudence or practical wisdom. All right. So this leads to a second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's account of what the human good consists of? Why or why not? Do you find his function argument for the primacy of virtuous activity within the human good to be a sound one? Does Aristotle's account of the happy life satisfy his own criteria of completeness, self-sufficiency, and choice-worthiness? So that's the second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's account of what the human good consists of? Why or why not? Do you find his function argument for the primacy of virtuous activity within the human good to be a sound one? Does Aristotle's account of the human life satisfy his own criteria of completeness, self-sufficiency, and choice-worthiness? Okay, so that's the basic work of Book 1. Briefly, I just want to mention what's going on in chapters 9 through 12, where Aristotle is tackling some more peripheral puzzles that arise from this account of the human good. So chapter 9 deals with how happiness is achieved. Because of the role that a sufficient amount of external goods plays for the good life, Aristotle is conscious of the role that good luck plays in happiness. And chapter 9 reflects upon the extent to which we can achieve happiness by our own efforts and the extent to which it depends upon luck or chance. As we've seen, one is unlikely to acquire the appropriate virtues unless one has been lucky enough to have been born into a good family and into a good polis or a political society. A corrupt family or decadent city would be disastrous for the good life. Furthermore, external goods such as good health or beauty are largely out of one's control. And even if someone has been blessed with a great start in life, it can, be blown through misfortune that they're not responsible for, like Priam, the king of Troy. The example of Priam raises a puzzle that Aristotle mentions in chapter 10. Can we be said to be happy during our lifetime? Can we be happy during our lifetime? This question arises as a puzzle only because of the differences, I think, between eudaimonia and our modern conception of happiness that I discussed in the previous video. Now, the paradox here is that if Priam cannot be said to be happy, then no one can. Priam's the king of the wealthiest city in the region and so forth. But it seems that Priam cannot be said to be happy because of what happened to him during the invasion and destruction of Troy that's cataloged by Homer. So is happiness moot in that case? Is it an empty concept? That's the problem that he's considering. Related to this is the puzzle of whether someone can be harmed after their death. Consider a case in which a mother of a loving and very happy family dies at a ripe old age, and everyone's consoled that she lived a happy life. But then a year later, her country is invaded, and all of her descendants are, horribly mistreated and then massacred, and the family homestead is burned to the ground. Now, has this person lived a happy life? And at least from the conception of ancient eudaimonia, there's at least a puzzle here. Because this person seems to have suffered some misfortune. And merely because they died a year too early, they didn't escape the misfortune. That's the idea. Because their misfortune has to do with the relationship to the family as well. So Aristotle admits that these puzzles are difficult and very troubling, insofar as they seem to take our happiness radically out of our control. There's nothing we can do about what happens to our children after our death, for example. In chapter 11, Aristotle concludes that the misfortunes of descendants and friends after death can detract from happiness, but not so much as to make a formerly happy person unhappy. Whether that's an acceptable conclusion or not is subject to discussion. The way in which even the virtuous person seems to be at the mercy of fortune for their happiness only seems to make Aristotle double down, though, on the advantages of the virtuous life for ensuring what we can ensure about happiness. The virtuous life is more stable and resistant to ill fortune than any other life. And there are at least three ways in which the virtuous person is more resistant to ill fortune than any other type of person. The first one is that the virtuous person bears pain and hardship better. The second is that even misfortune provides opportunity for him to show his virtue more nobly in putting up with hardships. Aristotle says what is fine shines through. So hardships provides the opportunity for a virtuous person to show their virtue. And third, that he's immune from the worst misery, which is the consciousness that one has performed evil and shameful acts leading to self-loathing. So the point here, I think, is that anyone can suffer misfortune and ill fortune, whether they're virtuous or not virtuous. And the virtuous person at least has something to fall back on, namely their virtue that enables them to cope with misfortune better. But, of course, if you have an extreme degree of misfortune, that's not going to make you a happy person. But at least it helps to mitigate the effects of misfortune. Finally, this is chapter 12, it appears that this subjection to happiness and chance leads Aristotle to an explanation of why, if happiness primarily consists in a life of virtue, we do not praise people for their happiness. Typically, we don't praise people for their happiness, but we do praise people for good deeds and good character. So if happiness and virtue largely overlap, why don't we praise them for their happiness? And the answer is because happiness is and remains a kind of blessedness. Because of the role of good fortune, to be happy is akin to being blessed by the gods. And for that, one might be congratulated, but not praised. This is not to detract from the supreme goodness of happiness, however. What comes from the gods, rather than from man's own efforts, is not less worthy of praise, but rather it's worthy of something greater than praise. What comes from the gods rather than man's own efforts is not less than, but greater than what man accomplishes by his own efforts.